Y ahora sí, empezamos Barcelona Fashion Summit 2026. Hay un momento del año en el que en Modaes nos toca pensar cuál va a ser el hilo conductor de Barcelona Fashion Summit. Si en 2024 escogimos la magia de la moda y en 2025 fue revolución, este 2026 abrimos un Barcelona Fashion Summit titulado Crossroad, hacer moda en un mundo que tiembla. Los que hayáis asistido a varias ediciones de Barcelona Fashion Summit sabréis que nos gusta empezar la jornada con un vídeo para calentar motores. Seguro que os habréis dado cuenta de que, a diferencia de otros años, este vídeo que acabamos de proyectar, el de 2026, no da miedo. Es más, la música es bastante optimista y todo. Después de años sumamente complejos, empezando por la crisis del COVID-19, siguiendo por la crisis del Mar Rojo y continuando todavía hoy por la incertidumbre global que provoca Donald Trump, toca mirar al futuro con cierto optimismo. Bifurcaciones, nudos y algunos caminos sin salida, todo eso es lo que tiene la moda por delante. Pero también tiene algo que muchos sectores quieren, y es la capacidad de generar ilusión y de emocionar, porque en definitiva la moda nos hace felices. Y esa es una de las cosas que más nos gusta en Modaes de este sector. Y nosotros, que estamos a punto de cumplir 17 años acompañando a veces en los buenos momentos y a veces en los no tan buenos a los profesionales del sector de la moda, también estamos ante nuestras propias bifurcaciones. Hemos empezado el año reafirmando nuestra ambición informativa con un nuevo claim que nos acompaña. Somos Modaes, el diario global del negocio de la moda. También hemos lanzado una versión con vocación internacional de nuestra web, que es modaes.com/global, con información en real time, eso sí, ahora en inglés. Estamos ultimando el lanzamiento de un spin-off dedicado a acompañar al desarrollo de las empresas, poniéndolas en contacto con los mejores profesionales de cada uno de los campos. También nos adentraremos en el mundo de la cultura y todo ello sin olvidar Move, moda en movimiento y, por supuesto, sin olvidar nuestro compromiso diario con haceros llegar la mejor información. Barcelona Fashion Summit 2026 se ha propuesto poner sobre la mesa un año más los asuntos que marcan la agenda del sector y, sobre todo, aquellos que definirán la industria del futuro. A lo largo del día vamos a tener mesas redondas, ponencias y conversaciones en las que iremos intercalando el castellano con el inglés. Entre Triana Alonso, redactora jefe de Modaes, y yo os iremos presentando a todos los ponentes, y para las mesas redondas, como cada año, preparad preguntas, levantáis la mano, os acercamos un micro y la palabra es vuestra. Antes de daros los últimos detalles técnicos, permitidme daros las gracias a todos por llenar este auditorio del Palau de la Música Catalana. También muchas gracias a todos los ponentes por compartir su conocimiento y por su generosidad estando hoy aquí con nosotros. Y, por supuesto, gracias a los patrocinadores, Blackman, Splio y TikTok, así como a las empresas que apoyan esta edición, Comercia, Mixer and Pack, Moinsa Consulting, Nextail y Reveni. Y también a 080 Barcelona Fashion y a la Generalitat de Cataluña, que impulsa Barcelona Fashion Summit. Sin todos vosotros, Barcelona Fashion Summit no sería posible. Y dos detalles prácticos más antes de empezar. El primero, el wifi, si no me equivoco. ¿Sí? Están proyectando en pantalla ahora mismo las claves. A riesgo de que no me escuchéis, ¿veis? Lo tenía preparado, porque sabía que iba a pasar. Conectaros, porque en unos minutos lo necesitaréis, ya os lo adelantamos. Y el segundo, el horario. A las 11:30 haremos una parada para desayunar y a las 2:30 otra para comer. Os animamos a que exprimáis al máximo esos espacios de networking, porque de Barcelona Fashion Summit siempre salen contactos, ideas o planes de futuro que hacen mejorar al sector. Y os pedimos, como cada año, que nos ayudéis a cumplir con los tiempos de regreso al auditorio para poder, pues eso, cumplir con la apretada agenda que tenemos del día. Nada más, yo ya me callo. Y doy paso a la primera ponencia de Barcelona Fashion Summit 2026. Si buscásemos una palabra que encajase en el contexto actual, seguramente esa palabra sería riesgo. El Center for Risk Studies de la Universidad de Cambridge investiga catástrofes en todo el mundo y proporciona los marcos necesarios para reconocer, evaluar y gestionar los efectos de las amenazas sistémicas. Tenemos con nosotros a Dani Ralph, profesor en la Universidad de Cambridge desde hace más de 25 años y doctor en programación matemática por la Universidad de Wisconsin. Dani Ralph ocupa el cargo de director académico, además de fundador del Center for Risk Studies. Daniel, thank you very much. Please go ahead.
So it's fantastic to be here. Special thanks to Pilar Riaño for inviting me. I'll be honest, I'm pretty nervous. I know something about the fashion industry, but only from the outside. And so to be meeting folks like you is quite scary in a way. But hopefully we'll have an interesting conversation. I will run a couple of polls. And therefore, I'm hoping the Wi-Fi is working on your phone so that you can give me some responses. Okay, the title is Fashioning Foresight in a Mad World, and I'll explain as I go along what I mean by that. The background to the Risk Centre, we've been around for more than 15 years, and our mission is to understand better systemic risks and emerging risks, and particularly to work with organizations on their understanding of how to deal with those. And so you'll notice a bunch of logos here. And these represent, you'll see some financial services and banks, also insurance companies, and then you'll see some other companies, Reckitt's fast-moving consumer goods, things like toothpaste, Tesco's a British supermarket, EasyJet you might recognize, and so on. And the last one in the corner, bottom right, is a spin-out from the Risk Centre, which does sustainability analytics. So I'm actually one of the founders of that. So what I'm trying to say here is that what I'm going to be talking about today are things that we talk about with companies. We have our experts, we do our analysis, but ultimately that's not going to be any use if we're not working with organizations. Now we have 3 sections. We get to have a little bit of fun. If you like black humor, we get to have fun in the first section. That's just going to set the scene. And can we get better at prediction? The second section is really going to be asking, what can we do when we're living in a mad world? And because when Pilar first invited me to speak and we were talking, one of the themes was geopolitics. I didn't want to put geopolitics at the front because it would suck all the oxygen out. But we'll get to a little bit more. Geopolitics will be mentioned, but we'll get to a little bit more of that in the third section. Now, I want to introduce this idea of strategic risk. So this is the risk that your organization fails to meet the objectives of its 3 or 5 year plan. And I'm going to put this into what I'm calling the midterm or planning. So implementing strategy, presumably you're aiming for change. Maybe you're aiming for growth in some way. And how are you going to achieve that? So the unknowns you might identify, maybe they're to do with costs, maybe they're to do with competition, maybe you want to change or modernize technology, maybe you're going to enter a new market, maybe you'll partner. So the things that are in your 5 year plan are inherently themselves uncertain. But I'd like to bring some other things to that and challenge the idea of a 3 or 5 year plan, which I'm going to call a bet. And so the question I'm going to be asking is, what are the odds of the bet that you are placing in making your 3 to 5 year plan? Now, I could have talked about the short term operationally. I could have talked about, is your strategy fit at all? And I have to say that things are moving so fast these days that the short term and the long term and the midterm are all bumping up against each other. But maybe that's a topic for another time. Now, the first poll, this is just so that I can hear from you, to get us in the mood. I've listed, these are very generic classes. So financial, and you could put economic, finance and the economy. You can put geopolitics, technology, the physical environment, society and governance. And of course, politics could fit into social or governance, but let's say politics is in governance. So I'm going to ask you to choose 3. And the question is, which class of shocks, if you can imagine events that might knock your strategic plan off course, I'm going to allow you to choose at most 3. So which are the top 3 that keep you awake at night? And if we could display the poll, please. Great. I think people are logging in. And thank you for the thumbs. So why don't you release the question? Now you should be able to input up to 3 answers, but I won't release the result yet, so you won't see it yet. Does anyone still need the QR code? Put up your hand. If you could put the QR code back. Thank you. Corrupt to about 60. Actually, you're doing very well. Thank you. Once we get up to 100, I'll release the poll, but more people will still be adding their votes. 99, 100. All right, if you could show us the result, please. Okay. Okay, so geopolitics comes at the top. And second, we have technology for lots of reasons. Maybe generative AI is at the top of our minds. And then equal third, we have finance and economics, governance, law, regulation, and politics. Now, the environment is last, and society is second last. All right. Good. So I'm just making sure that I'm trying to keep you interested in your own organization through the conversation. I don't think that's hard. Let me carry on. Sorry, if you could skip back to the PowerPoint. Thank you. All right, this is where the fun begins. I'm just going to give you 6 basically headlines. Now, I could have given you 106 headlines. And the headlines I'm going to give you are largely from 2025, but some of them are from 2026. So let's just run through them quickly. Nothing you haven't seen before, but it's a reminder that risk doesn't come from one place. So let's start with financial. This dates back to early April of 2025. Donald Trump has had a couple of liberation days in his tenure. This liberation day was the tariffs. So it starts as an economic statement about the United States and the way it trades globally. But 7 days later, it's no longer an economic statement about trade and tariffs. It's about bond markets. So there was a bond market sell-off in the US. Bond yields are starting to go up. And the threat is that interest rates are going to go up, and that's going to cause inflation, and that's going to slow down the US economy. So Donald Trump pulls back. So this is a sort of a double economic and financial crisis, all happening in a week. Let's have a look at geopolitics. Okay, I couldn't resist. There are so many geopolitical things, but who can forget the United States all over Canada and Greenland? I mean, if it wasn't a joke, if it wasn't real, it would be a fantastic joke. What more to say about this? This has also a consequence. It has reinforced in the European minds, if you like, the Atlantic Alliance, that there's something that's not working in the value relationship between the United States and Europe. As if we didn't know that, but this is another sign. And so maybe this is good news for countries who are not in the Atlantic Alliance. Now, technology, I already mentioned generative AI, and it's interesting just as a comparison. The 2024 Nobel Prize in Chemistry went to I think there were two prizes, but one went to the founder of AlphaFold, which did protein structures. But that prize was about this is an AI guy, right, who does protein folding and wins the Nobel Prize in Chemistry. That artificial intelligence was machine learning. That's the old AI. So what I haven't mentioned here is the new AI. But because everyone's aware of it, I'm choosing something which is behind the scenes. So quantum is behind the scenes, and it's starting to actually become a stable form of computing. So what I'm trying to say is, don't forget the things that are happening behind the scenes that are changing, because they nibble, they nibble, they nibble, they nibble, and then they bite. This is something we know. The planet is warming. Just because Donald Trump doesn't like to think so, it's still happening. And one of the reports the Risk Centre did just pointed out something which is fairly obvious if you look. It turns out that wildfires are now as big as hurricanes in terms of the insured loss. Now, the fancy language the insurance industry uses, they would say a hurricane is a primary peril, and they would have said that a wildfire is a secondary peril. And what does a primary peril mean? Something that's big enough to crash the insurance industry. So if it's big enough to crash the industry because the peril costs so much money to insure, that means you have to hold more capital. All I'm really saying is that the planet is getting more and more expensive to defend. It's getting more and more expensive to insure. And then this is an interesting one from the UK, but not only from the UK. Consumer habits are changing. They're changing as a result of weight loss drugs. So you can see this in the food sales on the high streets in the UK, and you can also see it's starting to affect clothing because people are losing weight. And again, this is not a short-term phenomenon. This is going to carry on for some time. All right, so we have had some fun. And my last one is going to be, I'm from Australia. You may not be able to tell, but from my accent. But Australia has finally, it's one of the first countries, well, I don't know of another country which has tried to regulate social media usage for children. This is in a very small sign of something which we need to do more generally, because in a way, the social media companies are like the oil barons in the United States 120 years ago. They're basically unregulated, or the regulation has not been applied. So now the world is starting to experiment with regulation here. We don't know what the effect will be. That was the fun part. This is the part where, apologies if I sound either like a school master or a preacher, but there is a little bit of evangelism that I will do here. And maybe it's useful for you, maybe not, but let me tell you what I've learned from spending many years in the Risk Centre and working with organizations. So can we get better at prediction when the world is going mad? And I don't think you'll be surprised that I would say, of course not. It's hard enough to do prediction in a stable world, and it's literally impossible to do prediction in a crazy world. So the sensible thing to do is to assume the forecast is wrong, and then ask yourself, depending on how badly the forecast is wrong, how do I react? We all remember COVID, of course. And so this is a retrospective of what happened in February 2020. Okay, so the person I'm speaking to is a senior risk manager. They're at a global company. They manufacture on all the continents, sorry, not on all continents, but they retail on all continents. They were watching their Chinese factories close. They have very good telemetrics. So they could see with what was in stock, who was turning up for work, and so on and so forth. So they were watching either their managers in person, or the European headquarters was watching their manufacturing close in January of 2020. And yet, by the end of February, this risk manager confesses, I could not imagine that in 1 month we would lose 78% of our global retail trade. And the interesting thing here is not the number 78%, because if I'd asked you, you would have probably guessed, 50, 60, or some other number, because we have the benefit of hindsight. The interesting thing here is the word imagine. Why could a senior risk officer not imagine? That is their job. It's to imagine tomorrow, right? So this is genuinely an issue. And so what I'm going to suggest is, it's just a word play, but forget about prediction. Why don't we use the word foresight? And the meaning of the word foresight here is the following. It's the art and science of imagination. Okay? What are the things that could happen? And then in brackets, why should I care? Because I'm interested in the events that could happen that are material to my organization. Now, this is a kind of a recipe that the Risk Centre has built, the Cambridge Centre for Risk Studies. Just due to lack of time, I'm not going to get enough time to talk about items 3 and 4. I apologize because you're expecting me to give you some wisdom. But when I talk to you, you will provide me the wisdom and I just package and give it back to you. It turns out that's the way things tend to work. But to get to the point that you need to get to, you need to actually become aware and you need to develop a corporate language for understanding uncertainty. And that's really what items 1 and 2 are about. So this is messy. What's the point? The point is that there's no such thing as a black swan. A black swan is something that you couldn't be bothered to think about before it happened. Now, I don't really mean that quite literally, okay? What I'm saying is almost all the events that hurt you, you had an inkling of. You could have imagined them. But if you didn't take the time to do so, then you weren't prepared. It did not mean you could predict them. You couldn't say when they would happen. You could not necessarily say how big they would be. And depending on the kind of event, the origin may be hard to assign. If it's an earthquake, you might know the earthquake zones. But if it's a cyber attack, geography has an entirely different meaning. So what is this thing? You can see there are 6 classes: financial, geopolitical, and so on and so forth. There are about 37 types. That's these ones. Counterparty risk in the financial column is a type. And there are 3 to 7 subtypes. So there are well over 100 items. I haven't listed them all. So this is a little bit daunting. What do you do with something like this? How do you make this thing useful to a business? The first thing you'd have to do is you identify the types that you think might be material. So you can do that qualitatively, or I can do it for you by reading your annual report. So you're putting together a sense of the world and you're putting together a sense of the business. Once you've got a risk type like tariffs, that's no good by itself. You need to convert it into a stress test. You need to convert it into some questions to the business. And we do that through a narrative, a scenario. So this could be an operational stress test. It can be a strategic stress test. Now, often you can write these quite simply. This is a kind of a cartoon. This cartoon is a US-European trade war. We wrote this one in 2016 or 2017. We've been using it ever since. We were thinking about tariffs applied both ways. It could be a 10% tariff between European and US trade, or a 20% or a 40% tariff. And then I used that word fun before. For fun, we said, why not 140%? Because this was in Trump's first presidency. Now, we wrote that down as a joke, and no one is laughing today, right? Now, it's no good. I've said you can't predict, so it's no good doing this once. You have to do this many times. Am I scaring you yet? In other words, the cognitive burden or the burden of doing this, right? You need some machinery. But if you want to understand what resilience is, you have to run a bunch of scenarios across who you are. Right? That's how it's you versus the world. What is the bet in your strategic plan? It's all of these things, as well as, will my technology work? Will that partnership work? Will that new market actually open up the way I want? So I'm not removing the fundamentals. I'm adding the things which are literally visible in the environment. So is it about a trade war? Is it about a regional conflict? Is it about a cyber which locks up your inventory? Is one of your facilities physically affected? What about your basic market? Are there competitors coming in who are offering something that you're not offering? But it steals their attention. 0 alcohol drinks. So this was done for a food and beverage company. And of course, your brand can be hijacked. So your high quality can be hijacked. They steal your labeling, they steal your brand, and they sell garbage. Okay, so, and this is just 6 out of as many as you like. Now, item 3, how do you go from qualitative to corporate? And quantify, quantify, quantify. This is actually genuinely a step up. This is not easy to do, but it's possible. So the Risk Center has done it for fictional companies or for companies which we don't deal with at all. We literally read their annual report and what we can find, and we build models. We've done it with organizations, and Resilience, the spin-out that I mentioned, does this for organizations, because when you're doing sustainability analytics, you need all this machinery. And the one thing I want to take away, you to take, is this word here. If you want to understand the multiple effects on you of scenarios, you have to have a model, not of your business, but of your entire ecosystem. Now, most companies, here I'm sure you put a lot of effort into knowing who your suppliers are. But most companies I deal with don't know much beyond their top suppliers and then the top suppliers of their top suppliers. They know tier 1, they know tier 2. They don't know tier 3, they don't know tier 4. Now, there are some exceptions, okay? If you're doing leather seats in cars, that might be tier 3 and 4, but that's because it's an exceptional component. So this is going to have to be pragmatic. Right? You're going to have to build a model of your upstream. You're going to have to build a model of your downstream. Of course, you're going to build a model of who you are, where your facilities are, what you do. That's the easy part. All right. And then what you'll be able to do is play a question in the form of a shock across your ecosystem to ask what operational and balance sheet impacts it has. Now, why am I spending so much time here? Because the digital twin isn't just about understanding your exposure to the uncertain environment. Yes, it is. But it also allows to ask you strategic questions. So we have been asked, what if I move my supply chain, this part of my supply chain, from China to India? What is my risk profile? If I change sourcing of this raw material to that raw material, what is the implication for my risk profile? So those questions, again, can be answered in this framework. Right. Enough of that. Now, little example. This is the year 2019. The Cambridge Centre for Risk Studies is very small. We're door knocking. We finally meet, not for the first time, but we finally meet the chief risk officer who is interested in things not on the company risk register. So we come up with 5, and they choose 2, but I'm giving you 1. Basically, we took our long list. We found 5 things not on their risk register which we believed. We workshopped with them, so qualitative only. What are the blind spots on your corporate risk register? And pandemic was one of them. Now, we had to actually understand how important it was. And we discovered, not too surprisingly, that it's material. So even though it's a very, very low probability, it has a very, very high impact if you're a retailer in the UK. So this retailer is in the FTSE 100, so it's one of the larger companies that are UK-based. They did some stuff, but very minor things. Right? They enhanced their ability to have online sales, and they enhanced their ability to manage their recruitment. And it's related to that's what a pandemic requires you to do. Now, the interesting part here, what was the benefit from this? I think the main benefit from this was the following. When the board is starting to ask questions to the risk function, what on earth is happening in China? The risk function can say, oh, this looks like a level 1 or level 2 pandemic, according to the Cambridge scenarios. So they had a plan, and the board was confident that the business managers could deliver on the plan should a pandemic arise. And when it did arise, when lockdown hit in March, the company didn't panic. It got slugged, okay? It got hurt. But it managed through that because it had the confidence to let the managers manage. Now, you know the phrase, the plan is worth nothing. The plan always breaks under fire, but the planning is worth everything. And that's what this is an example of. All right. Now, this is the bit where I give you some remarks about geopolitics, okay? Maybe you've been waiting for this, but I don't want you to forget about the other 5 classes of risk. Quick poll, if we could switch directly to the poll, please. Thank you. Now, I'm asking you a question. And put up the QR code in case. It's the same one, so hopefully it's still on your device, but yeah, just in case. I'm asking the question, when is the last decade that you think is at least as uncertain as today, as the 2020s? When was the last decade that you think was as uncertain as the 2020s? And I'm thinking of a country like Australia or Spain or the UK or the United States. Great. If you could show us the result, please. Okay. So my personal answer was the 1930s. Well, or the Second World War, 1930s, 1940s. We're getting a lot for the 70s. And I'm not sure, maybe you're thinking of the OPEC oil prices, stagflation, I'm guessing, I'm not sure. And we're getting a lot for the 2000s. And again, I'm making wild guesses here, but we had 2 things happen. We had the technology bust, but maybe that was small. But then we had the Iraq War. And we also had, at the end of the 2000s, we had the great financial crisis. So quite a lot going on there. Good. But this is the level of thinking. And I'm going to propose that we haven't seen a decade like the 2020s since the end of the Second World War in terms of sheer size and frequency of shocks. If we could go back to the presentation, please. Now, I'm going to give you 2 views of geopolitical thinking. One is through the blind spots of the Center for Risk Studies, okay? And the second is through international relations, which is the kind of theory. So look at 2014, Russian annexes Crimea. Before that, the Center for Risk Studies had already written its taxonomy. We've written several, and had started building scenarios. There's a pandemic scenario that we built, and we're writing war scenarios, okay? When we saw Russia annexing Crimea, we thought this is a traditional power play by a dictator, flexing their muscles. And when we built our global risk index, we made the obvious observation that geopolitical risk levels in Europe had risen simply by observing what Putin did in Crimea. Now, the shock for me personally and for some of my colleagues wasn't Putin. Yes, that was a huge surprise, but that is consistent with his politics, okay? What was a big surprise was Brexit and the vote and the arrival of the first presidency of Donald Trump. What happens? You know, I'm a global citizen. How could this happen? Then you realize I'm a global citizen from Australia living in the UK. I do not represent the UK. And at least half of the voting population of the UK are unhappy. So you know the phrase, it's the economy stupid from Bill Clinton? Well, in this case, it's the political economy stupid. So I'll come back to that. COVID comes along, and by the way, and also some slightly strange, different countries respond very differently. Okay, again, an example of the political economy at work. And by the way, the Cambridge Global Index still says that geopolitical risk is elevated. Hence, when Russia invades Ukraine, it's not a prediction. It was just, since 2014, the Russian invasion of Ukraine was more likely than at any time maybe than since, say, 1970. Right? So you don't predict these things, you just notice that the chance is going up. Then Trump is re-elected, and now we're building for the first time a dedicated, quantified risk platform solely for geopolitical risk, because corporates have finally admitted that geopolitics isn't something that you war game, it's something that you have to consider in your annual and your 3 to 5 year planning. Okay, so the long piece is the international relations version of this, and it kind of talks about alliances that are built on geopolitics and then on economics. And you'll note the economics has got full employment is part of the bargain that states make. And it doesn't matter whether you're on the Russian side of the Iron Curtain or the US side of the Iron Curtain, so to speak. It's the same bargain that's being made. But that sort of period of stability and globalization, there's a hyper-globalization period that takes us from 1980 to 2008 or 2010. And then in that hyper-globalization period, that focus on the pact between the population and governments gets lost. So employment is now given to markets. And guess what? If you go to liberalized economies like the UK and the United States, the middle 50% of earners have lost. And the 2010s is the decade where they realize they've lost, and that's when everything goes mad, okay? National politics gets crazy. 50% of the population lose faith that any political party can give them a better future. So crazy national politics now gives you crazy international relations, and Donald Trump is the obvious answer there. So where are we today? Without a new strong global direction, this is just going to continue. I see no reason why it's not going to continue. So national political madness will continue to drive all of these because we've seen it pop up everywhere. I'm going to end with this. This is not about Donald Trump, okay? Xi Jinping has already done something Donald Trump hasn't. He's removed the 2-term limit on being a president. And he controls all of the important institutions, including the army. So we live in a mad world. So build your digital twin, keep selecting and running your scenarios so that you can understand the bets you're taking and make choices to make better bets. Thank you.